So why is the celebration dinner important? Besides being an interesting subject in the Dan Markel case, and because it's so evocative, and because the story of Wendi puking her guts out at a dinner table in a nice Miami restaurant certainly presents an image and sort of leads inquiring minds wanting to know more. In the weeks directly after the murder, when Jeff Lecasse still had a few contacts with Wendi Adelson before she cut off contact with him, one of the things that Wendi told Jeff about was this celebration dinner. So in a thread that I found on Reddit about Wendi puking at the table, and in a discussion about what the significance of Wendi puking at the table was, there's really, I thought, a very insightful comment that did a good job of summing up the extra layers of significance of the celebration dinner story. And so this is a comment written by a user named Panic Like a Satyr. Good call. It's basically showing that Wendi is probably lying when she denies a fact that Jeff Lecasse has testified to. Wendi clearly shared specific details related to Dan and the murder with Jeff during their relationship, and even shared something intimate unflattering, throwing up at a restaurant after they broke up. So her citing of relationship timelines as common sense boundaries is misleading at best. And she claims they broke up because he had out-of-control jealousy issues. So by her logic, why would she even be sharing something like that with a psycho who is obsessed with her? And yet she did. I can't get over Charlie's oversharing. Sometimes it's hard to remember he is a fully grown adult and not a middle schooler trying to have an edgy persona. Some of the stuff he shared with Jeff, especially aggressive and/or inappropriate sexual behavior, is so disturbing. Wendi also kind of undid her own denial of the celebration dinner by saying it wasn't a celebration, but then saying, if anything, it was a celebration of her leaving the house after the murder. It seems like she was frustrated with the line of questioning and wanted the last word, but ended up admitting that there was a celebration dinner after Dan's murder. So what Panic Like a Satyr is basically saying is that the celebration dinner story is very important beyond just this story itself, but also because it's something that Jeff Lecasse told the police in the weeks after the murder when he was in touch with Wendi. And so I wanted to try to verify that. And so I dug around trying to find a police report or something like that. And what I ended up finding is in a Mentor lawyer video of Jeff Lecasse's interview with police, the footage of that, there's actually a frame in between interview clips at 1 hour, 1 minute, and 48 seconds on the YouTube video. That's the time code. There's a police report narrative summary that you can actually see on screen. That is the police report I was looking for, which has information about a follow-up interview that Jeff gave with ISOM on August 12th, 2014. So like less than a month after the murder, 3 weeks after the murder. And in that interview, Jeff mentioned that Wendi Adelson threw up after going to dinner last week, he says. So that means that, we'll get into exactly what date it would have been, but that means that the celebration dinner was probably closer to 2 weeks after the murder. So if we look at the calendar here in a second, we'll try to nail it down even better than that. But so it literally couldn't have been a month after, like Wendi said in some of her testimony. Just to kind of go over the logistics of this. So when Jeff was talking to police on August 12th, when he told them about the celebration dinner, August 12th would have been a Tuesday, right? So last week would have meant the week of August 4th through 8th, Monday through Friday. So that means that Friday would have been August 8th. So most likely date I always thought for the celebration dinner would have to be either a Friday or Saturday, right? And so that means that a good bet is that the celebration dinner happened on August 8th or 9th. So we're going to put a pin there because that seems like a pretty good bet, pretty high likelihood based on what Jeff said to police on August 12th. One other thing that's really interesting in this area of the interview is it's like right after this in the interview at 1 hour, 13 minutes or so, Jeff gives this incredible quote about which I always think of as the drum beats quote. It's one of the most interesting snippets of footage in this case, and there's a couple real good ones between Jeff and Tamara. But in this one, it's like Jeff is talking about how he sort of was able to sense on an intuitive level that something was rising and becoming like more and more inevitable as the time drew closer to the date of Dan Markel's murder. And it's just really interesting hearing him describe that. You get a real sort of sense of what it must have felt like to be Jeffrey Lecasse, in that, where sort of everything afterwards sort of makes sense and falls into place once you know what we now know about the hit and the connections between the Adelsons and the hitmen. But at the time, everything must have been so confusing and bewildering for Jeff.
I was walking around saying to my friends, I don't know what's going on. It's just uncanny to think back on it now. I said, I don't know what's going on, but something's gonna happen. Like, it feels like there's drum beats. It feels like we're moving towards something. It's really, really strange. I don't know what's going on. And one of the strange things that happened was we had a trip to California scheduled to see my parents the week that Danny was killed. And in early June, she rescheduled that trip.
The other thing that's really, I think, interesting about the involvement of Tamara Demko and Jeffrey Lecasse in this case is that it's only sort of by happenstance that they both became sort of a large part of the case in its afterlife, especially Tamara Demko, because she was only a very minor player in the case. I mean, I don't even know whether or not she would have been in police reports at all. I mean, I don't know that she was independently brought up by anybody in the investigation, but she just happened to be a friend of both of them, and I think she happened to also kind of go out of her way to involve herself in the case to some degree, like, by driving without calling first to the Adelson house, just because she sort of felt something was off. So it's just really fascinating listening to her talk, because it makes me like want to put a transcript of what she said through like some sort of analysis to see like what percentage of her language is it just seems like she's just such a unique profile as a witness. Brilliant and intuitive as that, somebody that with that high of IQ and EQ, I think it's very rare that they are giving testimony in a murder case like this. So very unique, interesting, rare insight, I think, to be gleaned here. I also think a lot about like what this case would look like in its afterlife, like with what footage is available and out there and what footage people are interested in, what it would look like if Tamara or Jeff Lecasse, if they hadn't gotten so involved, like would this case be looked at like differently, or it just sort of strikes me because I don't think that the Adelsons could have anticipated the fact that somebody like Tamara or Jeff Lecasse would go so out of their way to tell the truth when it didn't really serve them any direct purpose, and in fact sort of put them in an unflattering light at times, especially with Jeffrey Lecasse. I think he was very selfless in coming forward, and it just when I made a note about it, it just reminded me of that quote where they referred to the older brother as an honest Abe for giving the money back for doing the right thing at the cashier, and they just never anticipated that two honest Abes like Tamara Demko and Jeffrey Lecasse would be a thorn in their side in the cover-up of this murder. Okay, so now we're going to go through the different testimonies and all the different times when the celebration dinner has been mentioned. So now we've basically settled that we can. Jeffrey Lecasse's testimony is more reliable now because we know that both Charlie and Wendi don't dispute that this dinner happened. They may take some issue with how he describes it, but both of them acknowledge that it happened in their testimony. So now we're going to go over Charlie's testimony first, because he only testified in the one case about the celebration dinner, and then the three different versions of the celebration dinner that Wendi has given. Okay, so Charlie's testimony. He seems very certain that the date of the celebration dinner was 2 weeks or just a hair over, is what he says.
Did there come a time when you went out to dinner with your sister?
Yes.
And how long after the murder was that?
I'd say it was about 2 weeks after. Maybe even a hair more, but around about 2 weeks.
So just to sort of rewind to the date of the murder, it happened on July 18th, 2014, which is a Friday, which makes the dating of the celebration dinner slot in very cleanly with the date of the murder, because one of the assumptions I'm making here is that the celebration dinner is most likely to have happened on a Friday or possibly a Saturday. So if the murder happened on the 18th, which was a Friday, then if the celebration dinner was a week later, then it would be pretty easy for me, looking backward to reconstruct, okay, it happened on Friday, July 25th, a week later after the murder. If it happened 2 weeks later, then, it would be whatever it would be, Friday, August 1st or whatever it would be. So it'd be fairly easy, I think, to give a pretty accurate guess of when the celebration dinner happened if I'm thinking about if this would have happened to me. I think that would be pretty, just based on the fact that the murder happened on a Friday, I think is my main point here, that it makes it much easier, I would imagine, to estimate the date of the celebration dinner. So when Charlie says that it was 2 weeks or a hair over, that makes me think he's saying it's almost certainly August 1st or 2nd. So August 1st was a Friday, the 2nd was a Saturday. The other thing that sort of buttresses this impression is that the restaurant was very busy in Charlie's story. There's not a whole lot of detail in Charlie's story. It's sort of noticeable when we get a little bit further down the road here, talking about how, when Georgia pumps Charlie for some details about what they actually talked about, it's very clear that he doesn't have any details that he wants to volunteer. But in Charlie's story, the one detail that he does offer, and that does sort of come up in a couple different versions, is that it was busy and that they had to wait for an hour for a table. So again, this reinforces my suspicion that the celebration dinner most likely happened on a Friday, possibly a Saturday. So if it was 2 weeks after, that would be Friday, August 1st or 2nd. Could have been August 3rd, which would have been a Sunday, but it's a little bit less likely. The sushi place was called Juvia, according to Charlie's testimony, and I actually went through Googling this place, and I did find a place called Juvia's Sushi Garage that apparently exists in Miami, but it's not clear to me if it's the same exact place. And when I tried to find other people talking about this restaurant in reference to the Markel case, I didn't find anything, so I'm not 100% sure of that. But the current version of Juvia that exists online, that is a sushi garage in the Miami area, they're not open on Mondays. So if that was still true 10 years ago, that means we can rule out the dinner happening on a Monday. I think we were already pretty much there anyway. But one thing that I've thought about a little bit is like how it is that Wendi comes off so poorly. Because on the one hand, she is it seems like a very resourceful, crafty, clever woman. In other ways, it seems like she's incredibly juvenile, like the fact that her parents need to drive her everywhere, and that she seems just really codependent in a lot of different ways. But I've often thought about, how does Wendi know that she comes off so poorly? And is it just like, is there nothing that, I don't know, it seems like she's getting like worse and worse at testifying as the trials go on. So it's just curious trying to think about what must be going through her head when she's on the stand, and if just trying to think about like why it is she sucks so bad at testifying. And one of the things that I thought about is that, like, when you watch her interview with Detective Isom, it is pretty remarkable, because Isom, in other contexts that we've seen him in, is a pretty seasoned investigator. I mean, he's very close to retiring. He was on the force for close to 30 years, 10 years in that homicide detective role. So that's a very seasoned detective. But within less than an hour, Wendi was able to convince Detective Isom that she was not a suspect in the case, even though she said some very out-of-pocket stuff in that interview. If you go back and watch that, the first hour or so of Wendi's interview with Detective Isom, she says some really wild stuff, like tells him all about her basically going to the crime scene, and the whole TV repair hitman joke, and the bullet bourbon. Maybe he hadn't seen the bullet bourbon yet. Anyway, I think the contrast is with Wendi being interrogated by Detective Isom and then by Georgia Kappelman. Boy, that is a big gulf. And I am such a huge fan of Georgia Kappelman's style, and some of her sarcasm is just, her tone is so withering when she's confronting Wendi, and Wendi looks awful in her testimony, and that's been confirmed by jurors that were interviewed after all of these trials. So anyway, that's one thing that I think a lot about, is like, God, Wendi just comes off terribly to a jury. Like, if you have Wendi involved in your case, you kind of have to game plan your whole jury selection process around her being involved, because she's radioactive when it comes to a jury. I've never seen anything quite like it. So an interesting tangent on the whole Bullet Bourbon brand. Kind of hard to actually find info about their corporate history. Like, on their own webpage, they have a history section that's kind of buried and like doesn't really describe what the actual deal is, I think. Or from what I've found by actually kind of digging around a little bit. But I found one guy who has like a a whiskey review channel that got into it and describes it in a pretty good summary fashion. But the thing that I thought was just really interesting about it and ironic is like who actually founded the Bulleit bourbon brand. So I just want to play this clip right here where this guy does a great job of like describing where Bulleit actually came from.
However, the recipe then lay dormant for about 120 years until in 1987, his great-great-grandson, Tom Bulleit, picked up the torch and decided to try his hand at distilling. Now, he was a lawyer, so he stopped being a lawyer to become a distiller. Bit of a brave move, but I guess, he needed to feel a little bit more fulfilled. In 1999, he released his original Bulleit bourbon here, and he's been making this ever since.
So yeah, I just thought the whole Bulleit branding being like a facade and a marketing gimmick and being having this like super complicated corporate history and being created by like a lawyer in the 80s is just like just fits perfectly with the rest of this trial. Bullshit, fake frontier whiskey brand. It just so fits perfectly that that Wendi, that appealed to her, whatever, that bullshit branding message appealed to her. I don't know. Something about the whole Bulleit thing just feels sort of cosmically correct. So now we'll get the three faces of Wendi Adelson. She testified at all three trials that have happened so far, Katie 1, Katie 2, and Charlie. So in the first trial, there was the trial of the actual hitman, Sigfredo Garcia, and the conduit between the hitman and the Adelsons, the money men. That was Katie McBanoa. So in the first trial, which is known as Katie 1, Sigfredo was convicted of murder, but the jury hung on Katie. So then there was Katie 2, the second trial, and she was convicted at the second trial. And then last year, there was Charlie Adelson's trial where he was convicted. So now there have been three trials, and Wendi Adelson was called to testify at all three, and she talked about the celebration dinner at all three, which is interesting because it's just notable that a lot of different people and a lot of different Reddit comments have noted Georgia has put so much emphasis on the celebration dinner. And one of the things that I just really love about this trial is that because we know that Donna's trial is coming and that there's a lot of speculation that Wendi may be next, there's a lot of room for tea leaf reading, just like looking in between the lines about what questions that Georgia has asked Wendi on the stand and how that interacts with Wendi's immunity that she's gotten from being a witness, and why that might make Georgia sort of stop short when she's getting to some pretty juicy areas. And also it just sort of invites speculation about like what there's a number of things that it seems like might still be out there for evidence that hasn't been released in the public record, and so you get some sort of hints at what other stuff might be out there. Stuff like one of the main ones that's already been chronicled really well on YouTube is the WhatsApp messages. There's a really great video series on YouTube about that called Wendi's Television by a channel named Grish, which I'll put a link in the description if you haven't seen that yet. I'm sure you have, though, if you're watching this video. So first we have Wendi's testimony at Charlie's trial. TV repair appointment is described right before the part about the celebration dinner at 1 hour, 25 minutes, 35 seconds. Georgia asks, after the murder, do you recall going to a dinner where you were sick at the table? Wendi says, it was about a month later, and yes, I remember. Wendi's very snotty in this part of the testimony. Not that she's ever not, but especially so. Her mask is really falling off here. Georgia asks, where did it occur? Was that in Tallahassee or somewhere else? And she says, no, it was in Miami, and describes how it was at a restaurant. And Georgia asks her to spell it out, basically, did you actually vomit at the table? And Wendi says, I threw up at the table. Something that I've seen discussed on Reddit, and I think it's a good point, is that Wendi and the throwing up at the table story, and the fact that she even told it to Jeffrey Lecasse, is another thing that sort of aligns with a certain viewpoint that Wendi may have been trying to craft a sort of backup policy or sort of insurance policy. If her family did get in trouble for the murder, then she could point to this as saying, hey, look, this is when I found out about our family being involved, and it was so shocked that I vomited. I mean, that's a pretty clear little marker to have down there. It would be really convenient later on if you wanted to come up with a defense where you're trying to say that you didn't know before the fact. I mean, that's a very useful thing to have, a story like that in your back pocket that you told to somebody like Jeff Lecasse, who you're obviously suspicious that your phone calls with him were being recorded because you were profusely and over again denying your involvement in the case. It was obvious that Wendi knew that Jeff was somebody that she was basically talking through to the police as like a proxy or to the record, essentially. And that's just it, is that Wendy's MO is that she always approaches everything indirectly. She's the ultimate passive-aggressive person. She never does something to you directly. She tells somebody else, she ruins your reputation. She plants bad stories to her friends and tries to get other people to do her dirty work for her. It's always a web of bullshittery with Wendi. And then, Georgia gets into some questions about whether or not Charlie or Wendi referred to it as a celebration dinner, because that's what Jeff said, and Wendi denies that. At one point in here, at 1 hour, 26 minutes, 17 seconds, Rashomon makes an objection and has a really weird smirk. Such a weird little dude. Here's where we get a nice little Wendi speech where she can feign her righteous indignation, where George asks her, was that dinner a celebration of the murder of your ex-husband? And then we get this Wendi line.
Absolutely not. That dinner was the first time I left my house after over a month because I was terrified. And if it was a celebration of anything, it was a celebration that I was willing to leave the house and eat a meal.
And then right after that, where Wendy's sort of off kilter and making that little fake emotional speech. That's why I love Georgia so good. She's one of the best I've ever seen on tape, to be honest with you. But she hits Wendi perfectly with this shift of gears. So gives her a real deep shoulder fake, which Wendi just bites on completely. And Georgia then asks her, right after that little emotional speech about denying the celebration dinner, she asks her, did you know Catherine McBanois? Have you ever met her? Oh, this is just an ice cold move by Georgia. I love it.
Do you know Catherine McBanois, or have you ever met her?
I have met her.
Okay, so that was Wendi at Charlie's trial. So now we have Wendi at the first trial. I'll do the first trial first. Katie 1 and Segfredo. So her testimony in this. And by the way, links are all in the description for these. At Wendi at Katie 1, that her testimony about the celebration dinner starts at 25 minutes into this clip. So remember, this is the first time that Georgia's asked Wendi about this on the stand. And Georgia asks her, did Charlie take you to celebration dinner after Dan Markel's murder? At first, Wendi denies it. And then George asks her, was there dinner shortly after Dan Markel's death where you vomited? And then Wendi admits to remembering that dinner. And then Wendi gives this version, this self-serving story about how she was terrified that somebody was going to come after her or her children after Dan was murdered, so she didn't leave her house for about a month. So this is another reason why this story is so significant, not just because it has obvious significance as something that Wendi might try to use as a defense later on, and not just because it burnishes Jeffrey Lacasse's credibility as a witness because it confirms something that he told the police shortly after the murders, but also because it impeaches Wendi pretty badly on this point, where she says she was so terrified after Danny died for her and her children that she wouldn't leave her house for over a month. For about a month, she says. And then she says, she gives this whole spiel about when she was finally felt ready to leave the house and have dinner. She went to dinner with just her and her brother, which is odd. You'd think that if she was so freaked out, she'd want to go to dinner with more people, with her whole family, or at least, some more support than just her and her brother. It's very odd, and especially at a packed bar where they have to wait for a table for over an hour. But apparently that's the choice that she made. But, not only that, the whole sort of discontinuity of all of this stuff not quite making sense as a story, but we also know that she's exaggerating about the length of time that she was frightened for her safety. She said she'd barely eaten in the first month, just out of grief and shock. And so it just looks a lot different when she says it's, trying to make it seem like it was about a month in this instance, and it wasn't even 2 weeks, most likely. And then at the end of this little spiel, she's talking about how she had a drink and she wasn't eating anything, and then she has a weird little half laugh here when she's talking about drinking alcohol and throwing up at the table. It's like these weird. It's a telltale sign about Wendi and Charlie being over rehearsed. They have these same little anecdotes that they plug in at the same times, and it just comes off really bad, especially when you can't help yourself, but being such a blatherer that you say the same things a couple times during your short testimony in the case, which has happened in multiple instances in this series of trials. So at the end of this one, again, Wendi denies that her brother ever referred to it as a celebration dinner.
After the murder of Mr. Markel, did Charlie Adelson take you out for a celebration dinner?
No.
Do you recall any dinner where shortly after Mr. Markel's death where you were with Mr. Charlie Adelson and vomited?
I do remember that dinner. I'm sorry?
Go ahead, I interrupted you.
After Danny died, I was terrified that someone was going to come after me or my children and harm us as well. And so I didn't leave my house for about a month. And when I finally felt ready to leave the house and have dinner, I told my brother that I wanted to have dinner, that I was ready to finally go to a restaurant and eat a meal again. And I'd barely eaten for a full month, just out of grief and shock. And so that night, when I finally ate for the first time, they ended up taking a while before they sat us, and they sat us at the bar, and I had a drink, and I wasn't used to eating anything or drinking alcohol, and I threw up at the table, the only time in my life I've done something like that, but it was certainly not a celebration.
And you never heard your brother refer to it in that way?
No.
Okay.
Then finally, we just have a clip here from Katie 2, which is the second of 3 trials, the retrial of Catherine McBanawa. And here we have Wendi also talking about the celebration dinner, and again emphasizing how terrified she was and how this was her first time testing the waters, reintegrating herself back out there into the big scary world.
Was there a dinner, a time when you went out to dinner with your brother after the murder where you vomited at the table? That happened. It's just yes or no.
Well, would you like to know the context? It did happen.
Okay, and who was present at that dinner?
Just my brother and me.
Okay, and that was kind of your first time out after this murder had occurred, right?
After it happened, I couldn't eat for several weeks, and then I was completely terrified to leave my house. So this was the first time I tried to leave the house and eat food, and that is how it ended up. I threw up.
At the dinner table, in a restaurant?
Yes, it was very embarrassing.
How long after the murder was that incident?
Probably about a month or so.
Was the dinner intended to be a celebration of the fact that your husband was murdered?
Absolutely not.
Did your brother refer to it as a celebration?
I highly doubt that.
Could that have been one of his jokes that was in bad taste?
He may have been celebrating the fact that I was willing to leave the house.
And just for completeness sake, now I'm going to play Wendi's testimony at Charlie's trial. We talked a little bit about it earlier in the video, but I didn't play the whole thing, and so now I'm going to play the whole celebration dinner segment just so this video has the 3 Wendi testimonies right back to back to back. So here's Wendi at Charlie's trial talking about the celebration dinner.
And after the murder, do you recall going to a dinner where you got sick at the table?
It was about a month later, and yes, I remember.
Where did that dinner occur? Was that here in Tallahassee or somewhere else?
No, it was in Miami.
All right. And was it like out at a restaurant?
It was at a restaurant.
All right. And when we say you got sick at the table, did you actually vomit at the table?
I threw up at the table.
All right. And did you ever hear your brother refer to that particular dinner as a celebratory dinner?
No.
Did you tell Jeffrey Lecasse that your brother called that a celebratory dinner?
I did not.
Was that a...
One moment, Ms. Calhoun.
Yes, sir.
The objection.
Hearsay.
Overruled.
Was that dinner a celebration of the murder of your ex-husband?
Absolutely not. That dinner was the first time I left my house after over a month because I was terrified. And if it was a celebration of anything, it was a celebration that I was willing to leave the house and eat a meal.
Do you know Catherine McBanawa, or have you ever met her?
I have met her.
Did you have an independent friendship with her, or did you only know her through your brother?
I only knew her through my brother.
What was her relationship to your brother?
They dated at some point.
I left a couple questions in there at the end of Wendy's testimony, just because I thought it was interesting that as I mentioned earlier, Georgia really effectively shifted gears there from talking about the celebration dinner to talking about whether or not Wendi knew Catherine McManawa. And I just also thought it was interesting that that area of the testimony I was so focused on was like right next door to the couple lines that Wendi talks about her and Catherine McManawa, which are heavily featured in the Wendy's television series, which I also mentioned earlier in this video. So that area of the testimony, there's something very significant about, everything that George asks, I think is significant, but there's a couple areas that are ripe for further inquiry, I think, right there for sure. Just to sort of wrap up the details about the different ways that Wendi has referred to the celebration dinner in those 3 videos. In some of the earlier ones, it seems like she's a little bit less sure about the date. She'll say something like almost a month, or I guess not quite as, it seems like her impression is not quite as strong. But then what's interesting to me is that with like the latest testimony, Wendi at Charlie's trial, so it's the farthest away from the murder, she has like the celebration dinner date extending further out. She says over a month. I thought that was notable, especially because you'd think that, Wendi has probably spent a ton of time poring over a timeline and looking at all these details that are fact. And, she definitely knows that Jeff Lecasse told the police about the celebration dinner on August 12th. It's just interesting that Wendi continues to exaggerate when there's every reason to believe that she knows that her version of events is not accurate in some verifiable way there. But it's always the thing with Wendi is that she's always sort of stretching things, and so her being off by a couple weeks for the celebration dinner isn't at the end of the day the hugest deal, but it is one of the few things that's like a verifiable fact that you can take issue with. And I also think that sort of points back to another thing that's really interesting about Wendi's testimony that I wanted to explore in a further video, is that Wendi uses what it basically accepts or adopts the phrasing that Georgie uses a lot, and you can see it there in those last few questions that she answered about her relationship with Catherine McManawa. When Georgia asks her, "Did you know Catherine McManawa?" and Wendy's answer is, "Yes, I knew Catherine McManawa." So where she basically mirrors the language, and that's actually the same word that Grish used in his video about Wendy's television, is that Wendi uses a lot of mirrored language, and I've noticed that too. And I think part of the purposes of the mirrored language is not only to try to establish rapport with Georgia or the jurors, because mirroring the language or, sort of accepting or adopting some of the phrasing or body language of, who you're talking to can help to establish a rapport through sort of nonverbal signaling. But it also, I think, has another added benefit for Wendi in that it basically reduces her linguistic footprint in the record. So, because she's not coming up with her own way of saying whatever it is she's answering to, instead of saying, "Yeah, I knew Katie from when we met on the beach," and, kind of going into her own story and selecting her own words, she's just accepting or mirroring what Georgia says. So it's basically like her like the amount of data points you have to sort of make an analysis of Wendi and her language. Like, for example, if you were trying to analyze Wendi's language to find out like whether or not she's a psychopath, and I've mentioned this in another earlier video in this channel, is that there are researchers like this guy named Jeff Hancock who did a paper called Hungry Like the Wolf, where he was talking about how they analyze the language of psychopaths in social media, and also in people that are murderers, and just different sort of ways that you can analyze the language and what sort of things pop out. Well, if you wanted to do like an analysis on Wendi, for example, it would be a lot more difficult if she didn't adopt her own method of phrasing things, or if she didn't come up with her own language. If she just accepts somebody else's language and mirrors them, then it makes it so that her footprint in the trial is reduced, and so there's less data to work with if you're trying to find out anything about who Wendi is. So I thought that was an interesting sort of subtext of the way that Wendi has been strategizing with her trial. I think at this point she's trying to just sort of do harm reduction, just try not to create any more damage. I think she's smart enough and disciplined enough to be able to stick with the plan, like not talking on the phone. And that's one thing that is very notable, is that there's not many wire recordings of Wendi talking on the phone, if any. I don't even know if there are any, but there's tons of Charlie and Donna, and Charlie and Donna have both been arrested. So that's one thing that tells me it's going to be a lot more difficult to get Wendi, is that she has at least the ability to carry out a disciplined plan. So anyway, that's the video on the celebration dinner. Always interested in ideas for other videos, or if you have any input, feel free to let me know in the comments. Thanks, bye.